In 2019, millions of climate change activists took to the streets. Their figurehead, Greta Thunberg, addressed the US Congress.
I don't want you to listen to me. I want you to listen to the scientists.
Here's the thing. American politicians have been hearing from scientists about the threat of climate change since the 1980s.
This evidence represents a very strong case, in my opinion, that the greenhouse effect has been detected and it is changing our climate now.
3 decades on from James Hansen's testimony, climate change is now recognised as the defining threat facing the planet. So why has so little been done to stop it? "50 years ago, environmentalism was a fringe topic. But within a few years in the late 1980s, climate change quickly rose up the political agenda.
We have begun to fight an important battle.
We must also expect environmental responsibility.
140 species are becoming extinct every day.
At Rio, we have made a start.
This is an incredibly fast bit of worldwide discussion and diplomacy. It's hard to think of something else other than a war that went that quickly.
But turning this gathering interest into decisive action was another matter. In 1997, UN members met in Kyoto to agree for the first time on specific cuts to greenhouse gas emissions.
I am instructing increased negotiating flexibility.
But there was a catch.
The Kyoto Protocol put various constraints on industrialized economies to cut their emissions. It put no constraints on developing countries on the basis that at that point, the vast majority of emissions had come from industrialized countries.
Its origin in the UN gave the Kyoto Protocol universal legitimacy. But designing a treaty that all countries could accept meant producing one with very little practical power.
The UN has this fundamental issue that it's a creature of its members. UN organisations lack clout. They can't just tell their member countries what to do.
This wouldn't have mattered if every country shared the same urgent need for action. But they didn't. A sound environmental policy is likely to benefit everyone, but the costs fall on particular groups, typically those that do most of the polluting. And it's these groups that have a strong interest in avoiding these costs.
Most of the beneficiaries of climate action are people who don't yet exist, or certainly can't yet vote. And so aligning the general interests of that mass of humanity with the specific interests who are genuinely harmed by reducing fossil fuel emissions, that's a hard thing to do. It would be a hard thing to do within one political body, but if you have to do it between lots of nations, that's even harder.
America, a country which relies heavily on fossil fuels like petrol, coal, and natural gas, refused to ratify the Kyoto Protocol.
The use of fossil fuels has completely exploded, and it's impossible to disentangle that explosion from the huge growth in human population and in human wealth that took place at the same time. So still, about 80% of the energy used on the planet is dug up from the ground.
Fossil fuels were formed from the remains of organisms that lived and died millions of years ago. They hold a lot of carbon within them, making them a very concentrated store of energy, which helps to explain the political power of the companies that extract and distribute them.
There was a concerted campaign funded by various fossil fuel interests. And to some extent it carried on some of the tactics that have been used by the tobacco companies to try and avoid restrictions on tobacco. And the result was to undermine the science of climate change. Beyond this, it played into a growing polarisation in politics. The right tends to think that governments should regulate less, sometimes much less. And there's no real way through the climate crisis without governments taking a very active role in the economy. So if your starting point is not just I want to keep my oil profits, but I want to keep the government out of the economy, then wanting there to be less action on climate change kind of fits into that.
And then there's China. In 1997, China was considered a developing country and so was exempt from the Kyoto commitment to cut emissions. In the years that followed, it took full advantage of this exemption. In the decade after Kyoto, China's GDP almost tripled and its carbon dioxide emissions doubled, making it the largest greenhouse gas emitter on the planet.
The Chinese attitude to climate action was basically that it was for someone else to do. It was not going to get in the way of China's extraordinary dash to industrialization.
从发达国家来讲，不应该对发展中国家提出种种不合理的、超越公约规定的要求。
For almost 2 decades, China refused to act. But in the 2010s, all that changed.
为推动建立公平有效的全球应对气候变化机制。
So why the change of heart?
One reason may be that China genuinely does have quite a lot to lose from climate change. And another thing is, in that period, renewable energy really starts to become a factor, and they're really going to be able to produce some power, and China's quite keen on making it. And so leading a renewables revolution is a sort of thing that the Chinese Communist Party can get behind.
The Paris Agreement required all countries, both developed and developing, to commit to tackling global warming. It set a specific target. The increase in average global temperature should be kept well below 2 degrees, with strenuous efforts made to keep it down to 1.5 degrees. But as with every previous breakthrough agreement, it involved compromise.
The problem with this is that that was achieved by saying to all the countries, you tell us what you can do and that's great. They'd basically given up on the idea that countries would commit in some sort of like legally binding way to specific reduction.
The emissions cuts that nations actually promised were far too small to meet the 2-degree target.
There is a problem setting goals for 50 years' time when your actions that you've announced to do in the next 10 years are insufficient. And within the climate diplomatic community, there's now a talk of ratcheting up. As things go on, countries will get more developed, more ambitious in what they promise.
If countries really do ratchet up their action against climate change, it would break the 50-year cycle in which political compromises have repeatedly enabled governments to avoid taking effective action. In that time, CO2 emissions have more than doubled, and every decade since then has been warmer than the one before. 50 years on from the first Earth Day, a new generation of environmental activists are taking to the streets. They're determined to ensure that politics finally delivers the drastic action needed to protect the planet.
I'm Oliver Morton. I'm the briefings editor at The Economist. We've written a series of climate briefs to cover the basics and a bit more than the basics on all sorts of aspects of the climate crisis that's facing the Earth. You can read them all at the link opposite. Thank you for watching.